Marcus paid $25 for 200 acres of desert that everyone in town swore would be his grave. The skeletal black horse that staggered onto his land 3 months later carried a leather pouch around its neck, and inside was a 15-year-old letter from a dead man and a brass key to something buried beneath the sand. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The year was 1987, and Marcus Holloway had just made what everyone in his small Texas town called the worst decision of his life. Standing at the county clerk's office in Dusty Creek, he signed his name to a deed that transferred ownership of 200 acres of barren desert land to him for the grand sum of $25. The clerk, a weathered woman named Betty, who had seen countless transactions pass through her hands, looked at Marcus with a mixture of pity and disbelief as she stamped the paperwork. She had heard about this particular parcel of land, a stretch of nothing but sand, saguaro cacti, and sun-scorched earth that had been abandoned by 3 previous owners, each one convinced they could somehow tame it before eventually walking away in defeat. Marcus was 32 years old, recently divorced, and carrying the kind of pain that only comes from losing everything you thought defined your existence. His wife had left him for a man with a steady paycheck and a house that did not require constant repairs. His family farm, the one that had been passed down through 3 generations of Holloways, had been sold at auction to pay off debts that seemed to multiply faster than he could count them. He had nothing left except a rusted pickup truck, a few $100s in savings, and a stubborn streak that his mother always said would either be his salvation or his destruction. When his cousin Randall told him about the desert land being sold for practically nothing at a tax auction, Marcus had driven 4 hours just to see it for himself. What he found was exactly what everyone had warned him about. The land stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, the ground cracked and hostile, dotted with scraggly brush and the skeletal arms of saguaro cacti reaching toward a cloudless sky. There was no water, no shade worth mentioning, and certainly no indication that anything could ever grow there. A reasonable man would have turned around and driven back home, but Marcus had stopped being reasonable the moment his wife handed him divorce papers in their kitchen while he was still holding his morning coffee. He bought the land because it was the only thing he could afford. He bought it because everyone said he was a fool, and there was something perversely satisfying about proving that he could be an even bigger fool than they imagined. But mostly he bought it because he had nowhere else to go and nothing else to lose. The desert, for all its hostility, offered him something no one else could. It offered him solitude, a place where he could lick his wounds without the pitying glances of neighbors who remembered when the Holloway farm was the pride of the county. The first weeks on the land were brutal. Marcus set up a basic camp with a canvas tent, a sleeping bag, and a small fire pit where he would cook beans and whatever game he could manage to hunt. The nights were surprisingly cold, a stark contrast to the scorching days, and he would lie in his sleeping bag staring at the impossible number of stars overhead, wondering if he had finally crossed the line from determined to delusional. He had brought books with him, old paperbacks he had collected over the years, and reading by firelight became his only entertainment. The silence of the desert was overwhelming at first, a presence rather than an absence pressing against him from all sides until he thought he might go mad from it. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, Marcus began to adapt. He learned which plants could survive without much water and started experimenting with a small garden plot near the natural depression in the land where moisture seemed to collect after the rare rains. He built a modest shelter from salvaged materials and adobe bricks he made himself, mixing mud and straw until his hands were raw and his back ached with a constant dull pain. The work was grueling, but it gave him purpose, something he had not felt since the farm was taken from him. It was on a morning in late September, when the desert heat had finally begun to loosen its grip, that Marcus first saw the horse. He had woken before dawn, as he always did, starting a fire to make coffee and watching the eastern horizon bleed from purple to orange to gold. The sound came first, a weak and pitiful noise that he initially mistook for the wind playing tricks through the cacti. But when he turned toward the source, his breath caught in his throat at the sight before him. The horse was black, or had been once, before dust and neglect had turned its coat into a dull, grayish shadow of what it should have been. It stood perhaps 50 yards from his camp, swaying slightly as if the simple act of remaining upright required every ounce of strength it possessed. Even from that distance, Marcus could see the ribs protruding sharply beneath the skin, the hollowed flanks, the way its head hung low as though the weight of it was simply too much to bear. The animal was clearly on the edge of death, a walking ghost that had somehow found its way to his worthless piece of desert. Marcus stood slowly, not wanting to startle the creature, though he doubted it had enough energy left to run, even if it wanted to. He had grown up around horses on his family farm, had loved them since before he could walk, and seeing one in such a state sent a sharp pain through his chest that had nothing to do with his own troubles. He grabbed a bucket and filled it with water from his precious supply, water he hauled from a well nearly 2 miles away and rationed carefully for his own survival. Without hesitation, he began walking toward the horse, speaking softly, the way his father had taught him to speak to frightened animals. The horse watched him approach with eyes that seemed too large for its emaciated face, dark and liquid, and filled with a wariness that spoke of past betrayals. It did not run, could not run, and when Marcus finally reached it and set the bucket of water on the ground, the animal stared at the offering for a long moment before lowering its muzzle to drink. Marcus watched as the horse drank greedily, water splashing from its lips, and he felt something shift inside him, something that had been broken for a very long time, beginning to stir back to life. For 3 days, Marcus did not leave the horse's side. He set up a makeshift shelter using spare canvas and wooden poles, creating a patch of shade where the animal could rest during the brutal midday hours. He rationed his water even more carefully now, giving the horse small amounts at regular intervals, knowing that too much too fast could kill an animal in such a weakened state, just as surely as dehydration. He had seen it happen once on his family's farm, a rescued mare that drank herself to death because no one thought to limit her intake. That memory haunted him as he measured out each precious cupful, watching the horse drink with a desperate gratitude that seemed almost human. The animal had no brand that Marcus could find, no indication of where it had come from or who might have owned it. There were scars, though, old ones that crisscrossed its flanks and legs, telling a story of abuse that Marcus could only imagine. Someone had hurt this horse, had beaten it and starved it, and eventually abandoned it to die in the desert. The thought filled him with a cold rage that surprised him with its intensity. He had always considered himself a peaceful man, slow to anger and quick to forgive, but looking at those scars made him want to find whoever was responsible and introduce them to a similar kind of suffering. On the 4th day, the horse began to show signs of improvement. Its eyes seemed brighter, more alert, and it no longer swayed quite so dangerously when it stood. Marcus had managed to find some wild grass growing in a shaded arroyo about a mile from his camp, and he spent hours each day cutting it by hand and carrying it back in bundles for the horse to eat. The work was exhausting, adding to his already overwhelming list of daily tasks, but he found that he did not mind. There was something deeply satisfying about watching the animal eat, about seeing the first faint signs of life returning to that broken body. He started calling the horse Shadow, partly because of its dark coat and partly because it had appeared out of nowhere like a ghost from another world. Shadow seemed to respond to the name, or perhaps simply to the sound of Marcus's voice, turning its head whenever he spoke and watching him with those large, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold secrets Marcus could not begin to fathom. He talked to the horse constantly, filling the desert silence with words he had kept locked inside for months. He told Shadow about his failed marriage, about the farm he had lost, about the dreams he had once held for a future that now seemed impossibly distant. The horse listened without judgment, which was more than Marcus could say for most humans he had known. There was something profoundly healing about speaking his pain aloud to a creature that could offer no advice, no platitudes, no well-meaning suggestions about how he should move on with his life. Shadow simply stood there, occasionally nickering softly, and that was enough. Marcus found himself looking forward to these one-sided conversations, planning what he would say during the long hours of work that filled his days. By the second week, Shadow was strong enough to walk short distances, and Marcus began leading the horse around the property, showing it the boundaries of the land that he was slowly beginning to think of as home. The desert, which had seemed so hostile and unwelcoming when he first arrived, was revealing itself to have a stark beauty that grew on him with each passing day. The sunsets painted the sky in colors that seemed impossible, deep purples and burning oranges that reflected off the distant mountains until the whole world looked like it was on fire. The nights brought a coolness that was almost pleasant, and the stars overhead were so bright and numerous that Marcus sometimes felt he could reach up and touch them. Shadow seemed to appreciate the walks as much as Marcus did. The horse moved slowly at first, its muscles still weak from weeks of starvation, but each day it grew a little stronger, a little more confident. Marcus began to notice the horse's personality emerging from beneath the trauma, a gentle curiosity about everything around it, a playfulness that manifested in the way it would sometimes nudge Marcus with its nose or toss its head when it was particularly pleased about something. The bond between them grew stronger with each shared sunrise, each quiet evening spent by the campfire. It was during one of these evening sessions that Marcus made a discovery that would change everything. He had been examining Shadow more carefully, now that the horse was calm enough to tolerate a thorough inspection, when he noticed something unusual beneath the matted mane. There was a small leather pouch attached to a thin cord, so encrusted with dirt and hidden by the tangled hair that he had completely missed it before. His heart racing with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, Marcus carefully cut the cord and opened the pouch. Inside was a folded piece of paper, yellowed and fragile with age, and a small brass key. Marcus unfolded the paper with trembling hands, squinting in the firelight to make out the faded handwriting. It was a letter, dated nearly 15 years earlier, addressed to someone named Eleanor. The words were difficult to read, the ink having faded considerably over the years, but Marcus managed to piece together enough to understand that this was a farewell letter, written by a man who knew he was about to die. The letter spoke of love and regret, of secrets that had been kept too long, and most intriguingly, of something hidden on this very piece of land. Marcus read the letter 3 times, his mind racing with questions that had no answers. Who was Eleanor? Who had written this letter? And how had it ended up hidden on a horse that had wandered onto his property from seemingly nowhere? And what exactly was hidden on his land, the land that everyone had told him was worthless? He looked at the brass key in his hand, turning it over in the firelight, and then looked out at the dark expanse of desert that surrounded his camp. Somewhere out there, buried beneath the sand and the cacti and the endless silence, was a secret that had been waiting 15 years to be discovered. Shadow nickered softly beside him, and Marcus reached out to stroke the horse's neck, feeling the pulse of life beneath his fingers. Whatever secrets this land held, he knew now that finding Shadow had not been a coincidence. The horse had come to him for a reason, carrying with it a mystery that demanded to be solved. Sleep did not come easily that night. Marcus lay in his sleeping bag, the letter and key resting on his chest, his mind churning with possibilities that ranged from the mundane to the fantastical. He had heard stories all his life about treasures hidden in the desert, tales of outlaws burying their loot, and Spanish conquistadors leaving behind caches of gold. He had always dismissed such stories as the fantasies of desperate men, the kind of myths that kept prospectors digging in the wrong places for their entire lives. But now, holding actual evidence that something had been deliberately hidden on his land, he found his skepticism wavering. The next morning, Marcus woke before dawn as usual, but instead of beginning his normal routine of chores, he sat by the dying embers of his fire and read the letter again. In the pale light of early morning, with a clearer head, he was able to make out more of the faded words. The writer's name appeared to be Samuel, and he spoke of Eleanor as though she were the love of his life, someone he had been separated from by circumstances he only vaguely alluded to. There were references to a mistake made long ago, to running when he should have stayed, to a debt that could never be repaid. And then, most crucially, there were directions. The instructions were maddeningly vague, written by someone who clearly knew the land intimately but assumed the reader would share that knowledge. Samuel wrote of a rock formation that looked like a sleeping giant, of a dry creek bed that ran north to south, of a lone mesquite tree that stood apart from its fellows. These landmarks could have described 100 different places in the desert, or they could have described none at all, changed beyond recognition by 15 years of wind and weather. But Marcus now had something he had lacked for a very long time. He had a purpose. He began his search that very day, with Shadow walking slowly beside him. The horse had recovered enough strength to manage longer distances now, though Marcus was careful not to push too hard. They moved through the desert together, Marcus scanning the horizon for anything that might match the descriptions in the letter, while Shadow seemed content simply to be in his company. The bond between them had deepened into something Marcus could not quite name, a partnership that went beyond the usual relationship between a man and his animal. Shadow seemed to understand what they were looking for, or at least understood that Marcus was looking for something, and the horse would occasionally stop and turn its head toward features in the landscape as if drawing his attention to them. The first week of searching yielded nothing but frustration. The desert was vast, and Marcus's 200 acres, which had seemed so pitifully small when he first bought them, now felt impossibly large when he was trying to locate a specific spot based on cryptic clues. He found rock formations that could have been sleeping giants if he squinted hard enough and used considerable imagination. He found dry creek beds that ran in every direction, their courses probably altered a dozen times since Samuel had written his letter. But he found no lone mesquite tree, no obvious marker that would tell him he had reached the right place. It was Shadow who finally led him to the breakthrough. On a particularly hot afternoon, when Marcus had been ready to call off the search for the day and return to camp, the horse suddenly veered off the path they had been following and headed toward a shallow depression in the land that Marcus had dismissed as unremarkable. He called out for Shadow to stop, but the horse continued walking with a determination that seemed almost purposeful, and Marcus had no choice but to follow. The depression opened into a small box canyon, hidden from view by a ridge of weathered sandstone that Marcus had passed at least a dozen times without ever realizing what lay beyond it. The walls of the canyon were perhaps 20 feet high, carved by water that had not flowed here for decades, maybe centuries. And there, standing alone in the center of the canyon floor, was a mesquite tree. It was old, impossibly old, its trunk twisted and gnarled by years of struggle against the unforgiving desert climate. But it was alive, its branches covered in the delicate green leaves that marked it as one of the few thriving things in this barren landscape. Marcus stood at the entrance to the canyon, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. Shadow had already walked ahead, approaching the tree as if greeting an old friend, and Marcus watched in amazement as the horse stopped beneath its branches and turned to look back at him. In that moment, he could have sworn the animal was smiling, if horses could smile, as if it had known all along where they needed to go and had simply been waiting for Marcus to be ready. He approached the tree slowly, reverently, feeling like he was entering a sacred space. The letter had mentioned that what Samuel had hidden would be found where roots met stone, and as Marcus circled the base of the mesquite, He saw that one side of it grew directly against a large boulder, the roots wrapping around the rock in an embrace that must have taken decades to form. He knelt down, brushing away the accumulated sand and debris, and his fingers touched something that was definitely not natural. It was the corner of a metal box, rusted but intact, wedged into a gap between the roots and the stone. Marcus's hands trembled as he worked to free it, scraping away dirt that had been packed hard by years of compression. The box was roughly the size of a shoebox, secured with a padlock that had long since fused shut with corrosion. But Marcus had the key, the small brass key that had been hidden with Shadow all this time, and when he inserted it into the lock, he felt something give way inside. The lid opened with a screech of protesting metal, and Marcus stared at the contents with an expression that shifted from anticipation to confusion to wonder. Inside the box, wrapped carefully in oilcloth that had protected them from the elements, were bundles of cash, old bills that Marcus did not immediately recognize. There were also documents, legal papers covered in dense text, and beneath everything else, a photograph of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Shadow nickered softly behind him, and Marcus realized his life had just changed in ways he could not yet begin to understand. Marcus sat beneath the mesquite tree for what felt like hours, the contents of the box spread out before him on the desert floor. Shadow stood nearby, occasionally lowering its head to graze on the sparse vegetation that grew in the sheltered canyon, but mostly just watching Marcus with those deep, knowing eyes. The sun moved across the sky, casting shifting shadows along the canyon walls, and still Marcus sat there trying to make sense of what he had found. The money was substantial, far more than he had initially realized. As he carefully unwrapped each bundle, he counted bills that totaled nearly $50,000, all of it in denominations that had been common in the early 1970s. Adjusted for inflation, it was a small fortune, enough to transform his miserable existence on this desert land into something approaching comfortable, but it was the documents that truly captured his attention, legal papers that told a story far more valuable than any amount of cash. The papers were deeds, multiple deeds, all pertaining to land in this county. Marcus read through them slowly, his eyes widening as he began to understand what he was holding. Samuel, whoever he had been, had owned not just this 200-acre parcel, but nearly 3,000 acres of surrounding desert. The land had been purchased piecemeal over several years in the late 60s, assembled quietly through a series of transactions that had apparently attracted no attention. And according to these documents, the land had never been sold, had never been transferred to anyone else. It had simply been abandoned when Samuel disappeared, eventually reverting to the county for unpaid taxes and sold off in parcels to anyone foolish enough to buy it. Marcus thought about the $25 he had paid for his own piece of this puzzle, and a bitter laugh escaped his throat. He had bought land that should have been worth nothing, land that everyone had told him was a waste of money, and now he was discovering that it sat at the center of a much larger property that had been deliberately assembled by a man with a plan. The question was, what had Samuel been planning, and why had he abandoned it all? The photograph provided some answers, though it raised even more questions. The young woman in the picture was beautiful in a timeless way, her dark hair falling past her shoulders, her eyes holding a warmth that seemed to reach out through the faded image. On the back of the photograph, in the same handwriting as the letter, were the words, "Eleanor, my heart, my home, my greatest regret." Marcus stared at those words for a long time, feeling the weight of grief they carried, grief that had survived 15 years buried in the desert. He found more clues in a small journal that had been tucked beneath the money, its pages filled with cramped handwriting that chronicled Samuel's final months. The story that emerged was one of love and loss, of dreams pursued and destroyed, of a man who had tried to build something beautiful only to watch it crumble to dust. Samuel had come to this desert in 1968, fleeing a life back east that had become unbearable. He had met Eleanor in a small town 30 miles from here, had fallen in love with her with the kind of desperate intensity that only the truly broken can feel. Together, they had dreamed of building a ranch, a place where they could raise horses and live out their days far from the troubles that had driven them both to seek refuge in the emptiness. But something had gone wrong. The journal entries grew darker as the months passed, speaking of threats from Eleanor's past, of men who had come looking for her, of a danger that Samuel could not protect her from no matter how hard he tried. The final entries were almost incoherent, written in a shaking hand that spoke of fear and desperation. Samuel wrote of sending Eleanor away, of hiding everything he had worked for so that those who were hunting them could not claim it. And then the entries stopped, leaving Marcus to wonder what had happened to this man who had loved so deeply and lost so completely. The connection to Shadow remained unclear, but Marcus had developed a theory. Samuel had mentioned horses several times in his journal, writing about the animals he and Eleanor had planned to breed, the foundation they had hoped to build for their ranch. It was possible, Marcus thought, that Shadow was a descendant of those original horses, that somewhere in this desert there was a wild herd carrying the bloodlines that Samuel and Eleanor had so carefully cultivated. The pouch around Shadow's neck could have been placed there years ago, perhaps by Eleanor herself if she had ever returned to search for what Samuel had hidden. As the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson, Marcus carefully repacked the box and lifted it from its resting place. Shadow watched him with what seemed like approval, nickering softly when Marcus approached and stroked the horse's neck. They had found what they were looking for, or at least part of it, but Marcus knew that this discovery was only the beginning. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many threads left dangling in a story that deserved to be completed. The walk back to camp was longer than usual, weighed down by the box and the thoughts that churned in Marcus's mind. He thought about Eleanor, wondering if she was still alive somewhere, wondering if she had spent the last 15 years grieving for a man she believed was dead. He thought about Samuel, about the courage it must have taken to bury everything he owned and walk away, trying to protect the woman he loved from dangers that Marcus could only imagine. And he thought about himself, about the strange path that had led him to this worthless piece of desert and the treasures it contained. That night, sitting by his campfire with Shadow resting nearby, Marcus made a decision. He would not simply claim the money and the land for himself. He would find Eleanor if she could be found, and he would tell her what had happened to the man she had loved. It was the least he could do for Samuel, whose hidden legacy had given Marcus something far more valuable than money. It had given him a reason to keep going, a purpose that extended beyond his own broken life. Shadow seemed to approve of this decision, tossing its head and stamping one hoof against the hard-packed earth. Marcus smiled at the horse, feeling a warmth spread through his chest that he had not experienced in a very long time. The search for Eleanor began the following week, after Marcus had taken time to carefully study all the documents and journal entries for any clues about where she might have gone. The journal mentioned a small town called Crestwood, about 30 miles to the east, where Samuel had first met Eleanor at a diner where she worked as a waitress. It was not much to go on, but it was a starting point, and Marcus had learned that sometimes starting points were all you needed. He left Shadow in the care of an elderly neighbor named Walter, a retired rancher who lived on a struggling property about 5 miles from Marcus's land. Walter had been one of the few people who had not openly mocked Marcus for buying the desert acreage, and over the months they had developed a cautious friendship built on mutual respect and shared solitude. When Marcus explained that he needed to travel for a few days and asked if Walter could look after his horse, the old man agreed without asking questions. He simply nodded, looked at Shadow with an appraising eye, and said he would treat the animal like his own. The drive to Crestwood took longer than expected, the roads deteriorating as Marcus moved farther from the main highways into territory that seemed forgotten by the modern world. The town itself was barely worthy of the name, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a single main street that looked like it had not changed significantly since the 1950s. There was a general store, a gas station, a small church with a steeple that leaned slightly to the left, and at the far end of the street, a diner with a faded sign that read, "Rosie's Place." Marcus parked his truck and sat for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He had rehearsed what he would say, how he would explain his strange quest to find a woman who might not even exist anymore. But now that he was here, all his prepared words seemed inadequate. He was a stranger asking about events that had happened 15 years ago, carrying documents and photographs that raised more questions than they answered. There was every possibility that people would think he was crazy, or worse, that they would view him with suspicion and refuse to help. The diner was nearly empty when he walked in, just a few old-timers nursing cups of coffee at the counter and a young waitress wiping down tables near the window. Marcus took a seat at the counter and ordered coffee, studying the photographs that hung on the walls while he waited. They showed the town in various stages of its history, black and white images of buildings being constructed, of people gathered for celebrations, of a community that had once been vibrant and full of hope. He wondered if any of those faded faces belonged to Samuel or Eleanor, frozen in time before tragedy had torn them apart. The waitress brought his coffee, and Marcus thanked her before asking if the owner was around. She pointed toward the kitchen, where an older woman with gray hair pulled back in a bun was visible through the serving window. Marcus asked if he could speak with her, and a few minutes later the woman emerged, wiping her hands on her apron and regarding him with the cautious curiosity that small-town residents often showed toward strangers. Her name was Rosie, she told him, and she had owned this diner for going on 40 years. When Marcus showed her the photograph of Eleanor and asked if she recognized the woman, something changed in Rosie's expression. The caution gave way to something more complex, a mixture of sadness and surprise and something that might have been fear. She stared at the photograph for a long moment, then looked up at Marcus with eyes that had suddenly grown hard. She asked who he was and why he was looking for this woman. Marcus told her the truth, or at least as much of it as he understood. He explained about the land he had bought, about the horse that had appeared out of nowhere, about the hidden box and the letter, and the documents that had led him here. As he spoke, he watched Rosie's expression shift again, the hardness softening into something that looked almost like relief. When he finished, she was silent for a long time, staring at the photograph as if it were a window into a past she had tried hard to forget. Eleanor had been her friend, Rosie finally said. They had worked together at this very diner back in 1968, two young women trying to build lives in a town that did not offer many opportunities. Eleanor had been running from something, Rosie never knew exactly what, but she had found a kind of peace here, a chance to start over. And then Samuel had walked into the diner one autumn afternoon, and everything had changed. Rosie described their love story in terms that made Marcus's chest ache with recognition. It had been the kind of love that burns bright and fast, consuming everything in its path, leaving no room for caution or common sense. Samuel and Eleanor had been inseparable from almost the first moment they met, spending every free hour together, making plans for a future that seemed limitless with possibility. They had talked about building a ranch, about raising horses, about creating a life that would be entirely their own. But then the men had come, Rosie continued, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. She did not know who they were or what they wanted, only that Eleanor had been terrified of them. Samuel had tried to protect her, had done everything he could to keep her safe, but in the end, it had not been enough. One night, without warning, Eleanor had disappeared. She had left a note for Rosie, thanking her for her friendship and apologizing for leaving without saying goodbye. She had mentioned going somewhere safe, somewhere the men could not find her, but she had not said where. Marcus asked if Rosie had ever heard from Eleanor again, and the older woman nodded slowly. There had been letters, she said, a handful over the years, always postmarked from different cities, never with a return address. The last one had arrived about 5 years ago from a town in New Mexico. Rosie still had it, she admitted, because she had never been able to throw away anything that connected her to her lost friend. She offered to show Marcus the letter, and he accepted with a gratitude that seemed inadequate for what she was giving him. A thread of hope, thin but unbroken, leading toward a woman who had waited 15 years without knowing that everything she had lost might finally be found. The letter from Eleanor was brief, written in a hand that trembled slightly across the page, but it contained the one thing Marcus needed most: a town name. Sagebrush, New Mexico, a place so small it barely registered on most maps, tucked into the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Eleanor had written to Rosie about finding peace there, about a small adobe house where she could see the mountains from her kitchen window, about finally feeling safe enough to stop running. She had not mentioned Samuel, had not asked about him, or the land they had dreamed of together, and Marcus wondered if that silence was born of grief or of a deliberate choice to leave the past behind. He thanked Rosie for her help, pressing some money into her hand despite her protests, and promised to let her know what he discovered. The drive to New Mexico would take most of a day, crossing the border into a state that Marcus had never visited, through landscapes that shifted from Texas desert to high mountain country with a beauty that took his breath away. He stopped only for gas and food, his mind racing ahead to the meeting that awaited him, rehearsing conversations that he knew would likely go nothing like he planned. Sagebrush was even smaller than Crestwood, a handful of buildings clustered in a valley where a creek ran clear and cold from the mountains above. There was no diner here, no obvious gathering place where Marcus could ask questions, just a general store that also served as the post office and a bar that looked like it had not been updated since the Korean War. Marcus chose the general store, figuring that whoever ran the post office would know everyone in town by name. The woman behind the counter was in her 60s with silver hair and turquoise jewelry that marked her as someone who had adopted the local aesthetic. Her name was Dolores, and she regarded Marcus with the same careful suspicion that Rosie had shown, her eyes narrowing slightly when he mentioned he was looking for someone. Small towns protected their own, Marcus was learning, and strangers asking questions were not automatically welcome no matter how innocent their intentions. He showed Dolores the photograph of Eleanor and watched as recognition flickered across her face before she could hide it. She knew Eleanor, that much was obvious, but she was not going to admit it easily. Marcus tried a different approach, telling her about Samuel, about the love story that had ended in tragedy, about the hidden treasures that Eleanor did not know were waiting for her. He spoke with all the sincerity he could muster, letting the emotion show in his voice, hoping that Dolores would see that his intentions were genuine. The breakthrough came when he mentioned Shadow, the horse that had led him to discover the truth. Dolores's expression changed entirely, the suspicion giving way to something that looked like wonder. She asked him to describe the horse, and when he did, talking about the black coat and the scars and the gentle eyes that seemed to understand more than any animal should, she put her hand over her heart and whispered something in Spanish that Marcus did not understand. Eleanor had a horse like that, Dolores said quietly. Years ago, when she first came to Sagebrush, she had brought a pregnant mare with her, a black horse that she treated like family. The mare had foaled shortly after arriving, and Eleanor had kept both animals on her small property, caring for them with a devotion that the townspeople had found both admirable and slightly eccentric. But about 2 years ago, Dolores continued, someone had cut the fence on Eleanor's property and the horses had escaped. Eleanor had searched for weeks, but she had never found them. It had broken her heart all over again, losing the last connection to a life she had tried so hard to leave behind. Marcus felt the pieces clicking into place, a puzzle that had seemed impossibly complex, suddenly revealing its pattern. Shadow was not just any horse. Shadow was the offspring of Eleanor's mare, a direct link to the dreams she had shared with Samuel, a living connection to a love that had survived despite everything that had tried to destroy it. The horse had somehow found its way across hundreds of miles of desert, carrying the hidden message that Samuel had entrusted to Eleanor's care and had delivered it to Marcus at exactly the moment when he needed it most. Dolores must have seen something in his expression, because her remaining resistance crumbled. She told Marcus how to find Eleanor's property, a small adobe house about 3 miles outside of town, up a dirt road that wound into the foothills. She warned him that Eleanor was fragile, that the years of running and hiding and loss had taken their toll, and that he should approach her gently. Marcus promised that he would, thanking Dolores with a sincerity that seemed to touch her, and walked back to his truck feeling like he was approaching the end of a journey that had begun long before he ever bought that worthless piece of desert. The road to Eleanor's house was rough, more suited to horses than vehicles, and Marcus drove slowly, giving himself time to prepare for what lay ahead. The landscape around him was stunning, green and alive in ways that his Texas desert could never match, with wild flowers blooming along the roadside and pine trees covering the higher slopes. He understood why Eleanor had chosen this place, why she had come here seeking peace after everything she had endured. It was the kind of place where healing seemed possible, where the beauty of the world could gradually soothe wounds that time alone could never mend. The house appeared around a bend in the road, a small adobe structure with a red tile roof and a covered porch facing the mountains. There were flower boxes in the windows, filled with blooms that cascaded over the edges in riots of color, and a garden in the side yard where vegetables grew in neat rows. It was a home that had been loved. Marcus could see that immediately, a place where someone had invested their heart and their hope and their desperate need for permanence. He parked his truck at the edge of the property and sat for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he tried to steady his nerves. Somewhere inside that house was a woman who had spent 15 years believing that everything she loved was lost forever. Marcus was about to tell her that she had been wrong, and he had no idea how she would react. Taking a deep breath, he opened the door and stepped out into the mountain air, ready to complete the journey that Shadow had begun. The woman who opened the door was older than the photograph had suggested, her dark hair now streaked with silver, her face lined with the marks of years that had not always been kind. But her eyes were the same, those warm and gentle eyes that had reached out through the faded image and touched something deep in Marcus's soul. She looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness, the expression of someone who had learned long ago that strangers rarely brought good news. Marcus introduced himself, speaking slowly and carefully, watching her face for any sign of recognition or alarm. He told her that he had come from Texas, that he had bought some land near a town called Dusty Creek, and that he had found something there that he believed belonged to her. Eleanor's expression did not change as he spoke, but something shifted in her posture, a tension that had not been there before, a guardedness that told Marcus she was preparing herself for whatever blow was about to fall. He asked if he could come inside, and after a long moment of hesitation, she stepped back and gestured for him to enter. The interior of the house was simple but comfortable, filled with handmade furniture and woven rugs and shelves crowded with books that spoke of a curious and active mind. There were photographs on the walls, but Marcus noticed that they were all of landscapes and animals, never of people. It was as if Eleanor had deliberately erased the human connections from her visible life, keeping her memories locked away where no casual visitor could stumble upon them. She offered him coffee, and he accepted, grateful for the ritual that gave them both something to do with their hands while he figured out how to begin. They sat at her kitchen table, the mountains visible through the window exactly as she had described in her letter to Rosie, and Marcus pulled the documents from the bag he had brought with him. He placed them on the table between them, along with Samuel's journal and the photograph that had started his search. Eleanor stared at the photograph for a long time without touching it, her coffee growing cold in her cup. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, cracked with emotions that had been suppressed for 15 years. She asked where he had found these things, and Marcus told her about Shadow, about the horse that had appeared on his land half-starved and dying, carrying a hidden pouch that contained the key to everything Samuel had buried. The mention of Shadow broke something in Eleanor that she had been holding together through sheer force of will. Tears began streaming down her face, silent at first and then accompanied by sobs that shook her entire body. Marcus sat helplessly, not knowing whether to comfort her or give her space, watching as years of grief and loneliness poured out of this woman who had kept herself isolated for so long. He thought about his own losses, about the pain that had driven him to buy worthless desert land just to escape the pity in people's eyes, and he understood that Eleanor's suffering was of an entirely different magnitude. When she had composed herself enough to speak again, Eleanor told him her story. She had met Samuel in the autumn of 1968, exactly as Rosie had described, and had fallen in love with him almost instantly. He had been kind and gentle and strong, everything she had never known a man could be, and he had offered her a chance at a life she had never dared to imagine. They had made plans together, beautiful plans for a ranch where they would raise horses and live out their days in peace, far from the troubles that had haunted both of their pasts. But Eleanor had been running from something when she came to Texas, something that eventually caught up with her. Her former husband, a violent and possessive man who had nearly killed her before she finally found the courage to escape, had hired investigators to track her down. When Samuel learned that these men were closing in, he had insisted that Eleanor run again, that she take what she could carry and disappear before they could find her. He had promised to hide everything they had built together, to protect their dreams until it was safe for her to return. And he had given her the pregnant mare as a reminder of the life they would someday share. Eleanor had waited for word from Samuel, for some sign that it was safe to come back, but it had never arrived. She had assumed the worst, had spent 15 years believing that the men her husband had sent had found Samuel and killed him, that everything they had dreamed of had been destroyed along with the man she loved. She had kept the mare and its foal as the only connection to that lost life, caring for them with a devotion that was really a form of mourning, and when they had escaped 2 years ago, she had felt as if the last thread connecting her to Samuel had finally been severed. Marcus listened to her story with a growing sense of wonder at the strange paths that had brought them together. He told her that Samuel had indeed disappeared, that no one in Dusty Creek seemed to know what had happened to him, but that the legacy he had hidden was still there, waiting for her. The land, the money, the dreams they had shared were all still intact, preserved by the desert and the determination of a man who had loved her enough to sacrifice everything. He placed the deeds on the table, explaining what they meant, showing her that the property Samuel had assembled was still legally hers if she wanted to claim it. Eleanor looked at the documents as if they were messages from beyond the grave, her hands trembling as she traced the lines of Samuel's signature. For so long she had believed that everything was lost, that the life she had dreamed of had been nothing but a cruel illusion, and now she was being told that it had all been preserved, waiting patiently for her to return. She asked about Shadow, her voice breaking again, and Marcus told her that the horse was safe, being cared for by a neighbor until he returned. He described how Shadow had appeared on his land, how the horse had led him to the hidden box, how the entire discovery had seemed guided by a force that he could not explain. Eleanor listened with tears still flowing down her cheeks, but there was something else in her expression now, something that looked like hope. She asked if she could come back with him. If she could see the land and the horse and the place where Samuel had buried his love for her. Marcus told her that nothing would make him happier, and he meant every word. They left Sagebrush the following morning, Eleanor's few possessions packed into the bed of Marcus's truck, alongside the documents and journal that had brought them together. She had spent the night making arrangements, calling the few people in town who needed to know she was leaving, settling accounts that had accumulated over years of quiet living. Dolores had come to say goodbye, embracing Eleanor with tears in her eyes and whispering words that Marcus could not hear but that seemed to give the older woman strength. By the time the sun rose over the mountains, Eleanor was ready to begin a journey she had waited 15 years to make. The drive back to Texas was long, but neither of them minded. They talked for hours, sharing stories about their lives, filling in the gaps that separated them from strangers to something that felt increasingly like friends. Eleanor spoke about Samuel in ways she had never allowed herself to speak before, describing his laugh and his habits and the way he would hum old songs while working with the horses. Marcus listened with the patience of someone who understood that these memories needed to be released, that keeping them locked away had been slowly poisoning her soul. In turn, Marcus told Eleanor about his own losses, about the wife who had left him and the farm that had been taken from him, and the desperation that had driven him to buy land that everyone said was worthless. He described the loneliness of those first months in the desert, the feeling of being utterly alone in a world that had no use for him, and the way Shadow's arrival had changed everything. Eleanor reached over and placed her hand on his arm as he spoke, a gesture of comfort that acknowledged the kinship between two people who had both known what it meant to lose everything. They stopped for the night at a small motel near the border, too exhausted to continue but too excited to sleep well. Marcus lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. He had bought that desert land expecting nothing, hoping only for a place to hide from his own failures. And instead, he had found a mystery that had given his life meaning again. Shadow had appeared like a messenger from another world, carrying secrets that had been waiting 15 years to be revealed. And now Marcus was bringing Eleanor home to claim what had always been hers. The next morning they crossed into Texas, and Marcus watched Eleanor's face as the landscape began to shift into the familiar desert terrain that he had come to love. She was nervous, he could tell, her hands twisting in her lap and her eyes scanning the horizon as if looking for landmarks she might recognize. 15 years was a long time, long enough for memories to fade and change, long enough for a place to become unrecognizable, even to someone who had once known it intimately. When they finally turned onto the dirt road that led to Marcus's property, Eleanor grew very quiet. She stared out the window at the cacti and the scrub brush and the endless expanse of sand and stone, and Marcus could only imagine what she was feeling. This was the land she and Samuel had dreamed of transforming, the blank canvas on which they had planned to paint their future together. It looked nothing like the ranch they had envisioned, but it was still here, still waiting, still holding the possibility of becoming something beautiful. Walter was waiting for them when they arrived, standing on his porch with Shadow beside him. The old rancher had brushed the horse's coat until it gleamed, had braided its mane with the care of someone who understood that this animal was special. When Eleanor stepped out of the truck and saw Shadow for the first time, she stopped moving entirely, her hand rising to cover her mouth as a sob escaped her throat. Shadow's reaction was equally profound. The horse lifted its head, nostrils flaring, and let out a whinny that echoed across the desert. It pulled against Walter's gentle hold, straining toward Eleanor with an urgency that seemed to transcend the boundaries between human and animal understanding. Walter released the lead rope and Shadow walked forward slowly, deliberately, crossing the distance between them with steps that seemed almost ceremonial. Eleanor met the horse halfway, her arms wrapping around Shadow's neck as she buried her face in the dark mane. She was crying openly now, her body shaking with the force of emotions that had been dammed up for far too long. Shadow stood perfectly still, allowing her to hold on, occasionally turning its head to nuzzle her hair or her shoulder in gestures of comfort that seemed impossibly tender. Marcus watched from a distance, his own eyes stinging with tears he did not try to hide. When Eleanor finally stepped back, she turned to look at Marcus with an expression that combined gratitude and wonder, and something else that he could not quite identify. She told him that Shadow had its mother's eyes, that she would have recognized this horse anywhere as the offspring of the mare she had brought to New Mexico all those years ago. The resemblance was unmistakable, she said, and more than that, there was something in Shadow's spirit that reminded her of the dreams she had shared with Samuel, the hope they had invested in building something that would outlast them both. Walter joined them, introducing himself to Eleanor with the courtly manners of a generation that had been raised to treat women with respect. He told her that Shadow had been no trouble at all, that in fact the horse had seemed to know that something important was about to happen, spending the past few days watching the road as if waiting for someone to arrive. Eleanor thanked him with a warmth that made the old rancher blush slightly, and he waved off her gratitude with the gruff dismissiveness of someone who was not comfortable with praise. That evening, as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains and the sky erupted in the brilliant colors that Marcus had come to love, the three of them sat outside his modest shelter and shared a meal together. Shadow grazed nearby, occasionally lifting its head to check on Eleanor as if making sure she was still there. The conversation was easy and comfortable, touching on plans for the future that Marcus had not dared to consider until now. For the first time since he had signed those papers at the county clerk's office, Marcus felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The weeks that followed were filled with work and discovery and the slow process of building something from nothing. Eleanor had decided to stay, to claim the land that Samuel had assembled for her, and to finally pursue the dream that had been deferred for so long. The legal process was complicated, requiring lawyers and court appearances and stacks of paperwork that seemed to multiply every time Marcus thought they were finished, but Eleanor approached each obstacle with a determination that inspired everyone around her. She had waited 15 years for this chance, and she was not going to let bureaucratic hurdles stand in her way. Marcus found himself drawn into the project with an enthusiasm that surprised him. He had come to the desert expecting to wither away in solitude, to spend whatever years remained to him in quiet contemplation of his failures. But now he was planning fences and discussing water rights and sketching out designs for barns that existed only in his imagination. Eleanor welcomed his involvement without question, treating him as a partner in her vision rather than a stranger who had stumbled into her story by accident. The dynamic between them was comfortable and natural, built on a foundation of shared loss and mutual respect. Shadow remained at the center of everything, a living bridge between past and present that reminded them both of why they were doing this. The horse had recovered fully from its ordeal in the desert, its coat now gleaming with health, its movements strong and confident. Eleanor spent hours each day with Shadow, talking to the horse the way Marcus had done during those first difficult weeks, sharing secrets and dreams and fears that she had never been able to express to another human being. Marcus understood completely, having experienced the same healing power of that silent companionship. As the legal matters were resolved and the land was officially transferred to Eleanor's name, they began the practical work of building a ranch. Walter proved to be an invaluable ally, contributing his decades of experience and his network of contacts throughout the region. He knew where to find materials at fair prices, which contractors could be trusted, and how to navigate the countless small challenges that arose when trying to create something permanent in such unforgiving terrain. His friendship with Marcus deepened into something that felt almost familial, the bond between two men who had both known loneliness and had found unexpected community. The first structure they built was a proper stable, large enough to house Shadow and the other horses they hoped to acquire. Eleanor had located records indicating that several descendants of her original mare might still be living wild in the surrounding desert, and she was determined to find them and bring them home. Marcus accompanied her on these expeditions, riding out at dawn to search the arroyos and canyons where wild horses were known to gather. They found signs of the herd several times, hoofprints and droppings that indicated horses had passed through recently, but the animals themselves remained elusive. It was Shadow who eventually led them to the others. One morning, as Marcus was preparing for another search, the horse began behaving strangely, pacing along the fence line and calling out with whinnies that echoed across the empty land. Eleanor recognized the behavior immediately, having seen it in Shadow's mother years before. The horse was communicating with others of its kind, she explained, calling to them across distances that humans could barely comprehend. They followed Shadow's lead, letting the horse guide them through terrain that Marcus had thought he knew, but that revealed new secrets with every step. The wild herd was smaller than Eleanor had hoped, just 7 horses huddled in a hidden valley that even Marcus had never discovered despite months of exploration. But among them were 2 mares whose markings matched the descriptions in Samuel's old breeding records, direct descendants of the foundation stock that he and Eleanor had planned to build their dream upon. Eleanor wept when she saw them, tears of joy this time rather than grief, and even Marcus felt his throat tighten at the sight of these beautiful animals that had survived against all odds. Capturing the horses required patience and skill that tested all of them. Eleanor insisted on doing it gently, using methods that would earn the animals' trust rather than break their spirits. It took weeks of slow approach, of leaving food and water in places where the herd would find it, of letting Shadow interact with its wild relatives and gradually draw them closer. But eventually, one by one, the horses allowed themselves to be led back to the ranch, joining Shadow in the stable that had been built to welcome them. Word spread through the region about what Eleanor and Marcus were building, and people began to take notice. Some came out of curiosity, wanting to see the desert land that everyone had dismissed as worthless transformed into something viable. Others came with offers of help, recognizing in Eleanor's project something that resonated with their own dreams and values. A young woman named Sarah recently graduated from veterinary school and, looking for a place to establish her practice, asked if she could work with the horses in exchange for room and board. Eleanor agreed immediately, seeing in Sarah the same passion for animals that had defined her own life. As the months passed and the ranch took shape, Marcus found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He thought about the $25 he had spent on land that everyone said was worthless, about the broken heart that had driven him to seek refuge in the desert, about the morning when Shadow had appeared like a ghost on the horizon and changed everything. He thought about Samuel, the man he had never met but felt he knew intimately through his journal and his legacy, and about the love that had survived death and distance and 15 years of silence. Most of all, he thought about Eleanor, this woman who had become his partner and his friend, and something more that he was not yet ready to name. She had brought light back into his life, purpose and meaning and hope, for a future that he had stopped believing in. The desert that had once seemed like a punishment had become a gift, a blank canvas on which they were painting something beautiful together. He watched Eleanor working with the horses as the sun began to set, her silver-streaked hair catching the golden light, and he knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. 5 years passed, and the desert land that Marcus had purchased for $25 became something that no one who knew its history could have predicted. The ranch that Eleanor had dreamed of building with Samuel finally existed, not as a monument to grief, but as a living testament to resilience and hope. White fences stretched across land that had once been barren, enclosing pastures where horses grazed on grass that grew thanks to an irrigation system Marcus had designed, using water from a well they had discovered on the eastern edge of the property. The stable had expanded twice and now housed nearly 30 horses, many of them descendants of the original bloodlines that Samuel and Eleanor had hoped to establish all those years ago. Shadow remained the heart of the operation, though the horse was growing older now, its muzzle touched with gray and its movements slower than they had once been. Eleanor treated Shadow with a reverence that the other horses seemed to understand and respect, giving the animal the choicest spot in the stable, the first portion of feed each morning, the gentlest care from Sarah, who had become an indispensable part of their growing community. Shadow had sired several foals over the years, passing on the bloodline that connected the present to the dreams of the past, ensuring that Samuel's vision would continue long after all of them were gone. Marcus and Eleanor had married on a spring morning 2 years after her return to Texas, in a simple ceremony held beneath the mesquite tree where Samuel had hidden his treasures. Walter had served as best man, Sarah as maid of honor, and the guests had included neighbors and friends who had become family over the years of working together. Eleanor had wept during the vows, but these were tears of joy, of gratitude for a second chance that she had never expected to receive. Marcus had held her hands and promised to love her for whatever time they had left, knowing that every day together was a gift that neither of them took for granted. The ranch had become more than just a place to raise horses. Eleanor had fulfilled another dream by opening it as a sanctuary for animals that had been abandoned or abused, creatures that had nowhere else to go and no one else to care for them. Dogs and cats and goats, and even a pair of elderly donkeys had found refuge there, each one receiving the same love and attention that Shadow had been given when Marcus first found the horse dying in the desert. People from across the region brought animals to the sanctuary, knowing that Eleanor would never turn away a creature in need, and the ranch had become known as a place of healing for both animals and humans alike. The story of how it all began had become something of a local legend, told and retold until Marcus sometimes wondered if the versions he heard bore any resemblance to what had actually happened. People spoke of the mysterious horse that had appeared from nowhere, of the hidden treasure buried beneath a mesquite tree, of the love story that had survived 15 years of separation and loss. Some embellished the tale with details that Marcus did not recognize, adding supernatural elements or dramatic confrontations that had never occurred. But the core of the story remained true, and that was what mattered. Marcus had never found out what happened to Samuel, despite years of searching through records and interviewing anyone who might have known him. The man had simply vanished, leaving behind only his journal and his deeds, and the legacy of love that Eleanor carried in her heart. Eleanor believed that Samuel had been killed by the men her former husband had sent, that he had sacrificed himself to give her time to escape, and Marcus had no evidence to contradict her. But sometimes, late at night when the desert was silent and the stars blazed overhead, he wondered if Samuel was still out there somewhere, watching over the land he had loved and the woman he had protected. Eleanor's former husband had died in prison 8 years before her return to Texas, the victim of violence that had finally caught up with a violent man. She had learned of his death only after coming back, and the news had brought a closure that she had not realized she needed. The fear that had driven her for so long, the constant looking over her shoulder, the inability to trust or to settle in one place, all of it had finally lifted. She was free in a way she had never been before, free to love and to build and to become the person she had always wanted to be. As for Marcus, he had found something in the desert that he had stopped believing existed. He had found purpose and community in love, had transformed from a broken man hiding from his failures into someone who woke each morning eager to face whatever the day might bring. The losses that had driven him here no longer defined him, had become instead the necessary steps on a journey that led to exactly where he needed to be. He thought sometimes about his ex-wife and the farm that had been taken from him, and he realized with surprise that he felt only gratitude for those losses, for they had set him on a path that led to Eleanor and Shadow and this improbable life in the desert. On the 5th anniversary of Eleanor's return, they held a celebration at the ranch, inviting everyone who had played a part in their story, Rosie came from Crestwood, Dolores from Sagebrush, neighbors and friends, and even the county clerk who had processed the original sale with such obvious pity. They ate and drank and told stories late into the night, while the horses watched from the pastures and the desert stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. At the end of the evening, Marcus and Eleanor walked out to visit Shadow, who stood alone in the moonlight, silver coat gleaming like a ghost from another world. Eleanor wrapped her arms around the horse's neck and whispered words that Marcus could not hear, while he stood back and watched the woman he loved communing with the animal that had brought them together. Shadow nickered softly, nuzzling Eleanor's hair, and Marcus felt his heart swell with an emotion that transcended anything he could name. He had bought worthless desert land for $25, and it had given him everything.